In the 1970s and 1980s, Sammy Hagar may have seemed like the picture of success, but problems were happening inside his band. When it comes to his former bandmate Eddie Van Halen, Hagar is ready to tell everyone what was going on. Come with us as we talk about everything that happened in the famous Van Halen band that made Sammy Hagar finally decide to show the bad side of Eddie Van Halen. Eddie Van Halen and Sammy Hagar's work together in Van Halen was one of the most popular and well-known times in rock history. Hagar joined the band as lead singer in 1985, taking over for David Lee Roth. This was the start of their working together. When Hagar joined Van Halen, things took a big turn. The band had been having trouble with internal conflicts and a change in the music business. Eddie was already known as one of the best musicians of all time because of how well he played the guitar, but he wanted to take the band in a new way. Sammy Hagar, a popular solo artist and former lead singer of the band Montrose, added new energy and a different vocal style that went well with Eddie's playing. Their first record together, 5150, 1986, was a huge hit with both fans and critics. This record was different from the band's earlier work. It was more polished and radio-friendly, but it still had the wild energy that Van Halen was known for. Hits like Why Can't This Be Love and Dreams showed off Hagar's strong singing and songwriting skills, and Eddie's superb guitar playing went perfectly with them. The record went on to become a hit, cemented the band's place in rock history, and brought Van Halen new fans. After 5150, more records like OU 812, 1988, and For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge, 1991, went to the top of the charts. These records kept up the successful commercial rock style, and the band went on a lot of tours during the late 1980s and early 1990s when they were very famous. It was clear that Eddie and Sammy got along great on stage, and the songs they wrote together helped Van Halen reach new levels of fame. But despite their success as a band, things were getting tense behind the scenes, and the band's relationship started to change. But for a while, Eddie Van Halen and Sammy Hagar's work together seemed like a great idea. Eddie's unique guitar riffs and Sammy's powerful vocals made the band a rock powerhouse that marked an age. Since David Lee Roth had left Van Halen in the middle of the 1980s, they were looking for a new lead singer. Sammy Hagar seemed like the right fit. Sammy added new energy and singing power to Van Halen, which helped them reach a new level of success. When he got there in 1985, the album 5150 came out, which changed the band's sound and cemented their place in rock history. Why Can't This Be Love and Dreams became songs for a new age, and the band moved into a new era with the album's wide popularity. When Hagar joined Van Halen, it was a big economic success, but it also brought new problems that would finally change how the band worked together. Eddie Van Halen, who was known for his amazing guitar skills and new ideas in rock music, was clearly the band's main inspiration, but his rising personal problems started to cause problems within the group. Hagar's hard work and professionalism were well known, so she knew right away that Eddie's need to be perfect was making things difficult. Eddie's bad behavior started to hurt the band's relationships as Van Halen's fame grew. Eddie started to feel stressed out from having to keep up his success and make new hits all the time. It was also clear that his problems with alcohol and later other personal issues were hurting how he interacted with the other band members. Being an eternal optimist, Sammy tried to keep the mood upbeat. But Eddie's moodiness started to make things worse. Even though records like 5150, OUA 2012, and For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge were big hits, Things got worse between Hagar and Eddie as they recorded and toured for each new album. Even though Sammy had always loved music, Eddie's unexpected behavior was making him more and more angry. In later talks, Hagar would say that Eddie's mood swings made the workplace tough. He was honest about how Eddie's mood swings and lack of reliability made it hard for the band to work together. Sammy was dedicated to providing high-quality music, but Eddie seemed to be pulling away and his behavior was becoming less stable. Eddie's anger getting worse was one of the most obvious signs that things were getting worse between them. Hagar talked about a few times when Eddie would lose it during records and practices. As someone who valued efficiency, Hagar found it hard to work in this setting. Eddie and Hagar used to have a good artistic friendship that started to go bad. Eddie was getting harder and harder to get to listen to Sammy's artistic ideas or work with him in a useful way. It was clear that there was a lot of stress, and Hagar later said that the constant mental ups and downs hurt him in his personal and work life. Even though Van Halen was doing well, the fights within the band started to show in public. The people could no longer ignore the constant fighting and tensions behind the scenes. The increasingly hard working conditions on the For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge tour in 1991 made it famous. Even though the band was still making hits, the tension between Hagar and Eddie was too much to ignore. During later talks, Sammy talked about how he felt like he wasn't being involved in the creative process, especially when it came to the band's songs. He thought Eddie was once again taking charge of the ship without listening to Sammy and putting his own ideas ahead of them. In 1996, after another rough time of traveling and recording, Sammy Hagar decided to leave Van Halen. Not only did they have creative differences, but their relationship also fell apart, which made him want to leave. Sammy's anger reached a boiling point, and after years of stress, he left in a very public way. Sammy said he had done everything he could to make it work, but the constant problems had worn him down. He said that despite all the progress, it was no longer possible to go on as things were. Sammy's leaving was a big event in rock history. When such an important member of Van Halen left, it was the end of an era for the band. Sammy Hagar had a great solo career after Van Halen and Eddie broke up, but Eddie and Van Halen kept making music with other singers. There was a clear rift between Hagar and Eddie, though, and they never really got along again. Even though they worked together for years, the underlying tension never went away, and the relationship stayed tense for many years after Sammy left. The public was left to guess why Sammy left, and many pointed to Eddie's worsening behavior and problems. In talks, Hagar himself talked about how annoyed he was with Eddie and how their work relationship had gotten tough because Eddie was emotionally unstable. Over the next few years, Eddie and Sammy would sometimes talk about how their relationship was going, but they never got back together completely. In the years after Sammy left, Eddie's personal problems, such as his drug abuse and health problems, made him feel down. When Sammy Hagar left Van Halen, it was a turning point in rock history. Fans and music lovers loved when Hagar and Eddie worked together, but the truth was that their relationship at work was much more complicated. Van Halen's rise with Hagar was one of their most popular times, but Sammy had personal and business problems during that time that caused him to leave the band. Whew, it didn't matter what happened. Hagar always said that he quit the band because he was very unhappy with how things were going. He made it clear that the difficulties of working with Eddie were a big reason for his decision to focus on his own songs and artistic projects. His leaving Van Halen was a sad ending to a story that had begun with a lot of hope. Sammy Hagar and Van Halen's story is one of great heights, unforgettable rock songs, and a sad breakup that led to a painful breakup. People thought it was a great idea when Sammy Hagar joined Van Halen in 1985. With his lively personality and strong voice, Hagar added a new wave of energy to a band David Lee Roth and Eddie Van Halen had been fighting for years, even though both were on the verge of becoming famous. Roth had been the lead singer at first, but by the time Hagar came, Van Halen was already having problems at home and at work. Everything in the band was changing, and it was clear that something had to go. When Hagar joined the band, it gave them new life. Eddie's horn-driven guitar riffs went perfectly with his strong, high-pitched voice. With Sammy's love of music and Eddie's amazing guitar skills, they made magic that led to some of Van Halen's biggest hits like Why Can't This Be Love, Jump, and Dreams. Fans, the band, and the media were all thrilled with how well Sammy and Eddie worked together. It was clear that their sound was both old and new, so it would appeal to both old fans of the band and people who had never heard them before. Their records like 5150 and OU 812 did very well at the stores, and the band became famous all over again. But the perfect storm was building up behind the scenes. Eddie Van Halen was the mind behind the band's sound, but he was getting harder and harder to work with. It wasn't just music that made people angry, it was personal. Eddie's problems with drugs were well known, but it was his strange behavior that made the band feel stressed. Sammy, who was always the professional, looked at life and music with more drive and positivity. He wanted to keep the energy going and keep making music and playing, but Eddie's mood swings, unpredictable behavior, and growing anger were making it hard for the band to be creative. Sammy felt like he was pushing a big rock up a hill. In the years after their success, Sammy began to understand how different his and Eddie's ideas were for Van Halen. Sammy, who had worked in the music business for years, was eager to keep the band professional and going forward. To him, consistency, hard work, and attention on the skill were important, but Eddie was dealing with his own problems at the time. He wasn't the same guy who made the early Van Halen tracks so interesting. His own struggles with addiction were starting to show, and his behavior became less stable. Even though Sammy tried hard to deal with it, it was clear that the stress was making him feel worse. Things began to fall apart more sharply during the balance meetings in the early 1990s. Sammy had always been a good team player, but he thought things with Eddie were getting too bad. There were times when it was hard to work with Eddie during the recording process. There were heated fights, differences about where the music should go, and anger that the band wasn't working together. Sammy had been trying to get the band to focus on making music that would have value and last, but Eddie seemed to be preoccupied with personal matters, and things were getting worse within the band. When Sammy Hagar was finally fired from the band in 1996, things broke down. At that point, his relationship with Eddie had gotten so bad that it was no longer business, it had turned personal. Sammy was a big part of Van Halen's success, but he was all worn out from trying to keep everything together. When he was fired, it wasn't just because of differences in style. Sammy couldn't work in a place that had become toxic for him. It wasn't just a matter of business. Leaving the band was a way to protect myself. The news was all over Sammy leaving Van Halen. Fans were shocked, and many couldn't figure out how such a strong group could break up. To be fair, Sammy's choice to leave had been thought about for years. He could see the weak spots in the foundation, the fights between him and Eddie, and the bad atmosphere that had grown in the band. Later, in interviews, Sammy said that he still really liked the music they made, but he couldn't keep working with people who were stifling his imagination and letting personal problems get in the way of their success. The fight wasn't just about music. It was also about how the band was being run and whether they could keep making the songs that fans were used to hearing. The effects of Sammy's leaving did not show up right away. Eddie Van Halen even tried to keep the band together for a while by hiring new singers, such as Extreme's Gary Cherone. But the magic that Sammy had helped Eddie and her make was gone. Without Sammy's voice, Van Halen would never be the same, and the band's sound would never be the same again. Fans weren't the only ones who noticed the change. Eddie and the rest of the band had to face the fact that they were no longer the same group. The exit of Sammy marked the end of an era for Van Halen. The stress that had been building for years was now open to the public. While Sammy Hagar was still in Van Halen, the band broke up. It was the end of an age for rock music. In many ways, they could never get back the energy, chemistry, and success they had together in the 1980s and early 1990s. Sammy was an important part of Van Halen's music and their friendship, and when he left, the rock world was shocked. It was a sad end to a chapter that had seemed so hopeful at first. Fans were left to wonder what might have happened if the band had been able to get past their differences and keep making music together. Even though it caused a lot of trouble, Sammy Hagar's leaving Van Halen was the start of a new chapter for him. After leaving Van Halen, he had a great solo career, kept playing, and left a legacy that came after his time with the band. For many, though, the Van Halen of the 1980s and early 1990s, with Sammy at the lead, will always be the most important time in rock history. The question still stands. What might have happened if Eddie and Sammy had been able to work out their differences and keep making music together? We'll never know for sure, but the music they made together is still popular, and their time in Van Halen is still one of the most important periods in rock music history. Even after all these years, Van Halen's story, especially the years when Sammy Hagar was their lead singer, is still an important part of rock history. As long as people listen to music, they will always remember the band's famous sound, their huge hits, and the way Sammy and Eddie worked together on stage. Even though they were undeniably successful, there is still a sense of sadness about the time they worked together and a question of what might have been if there weren't been so many problems and disagreements. After Eddie Van Halen's sad death, everyone has had time to think about the band's history, how creative they were, and the problems that weren't fixed that caused Sammy Hagar to leave the group. When people think about the 1980s and early 1990s, they can't help but think of Van Halen with Sammy Hagar at the front. Their work together was one of the most important events of that age because of the energy, emotion, and dedication to making great rock music. The strong and versatile voice of Sammy became linked to some of Van Halen's most loved songs like Why Can't This Be Love, Dreams, Jump, and Panama. These songs weren't just hits, they were anthems for a generation. And Sammy and Eddie's friendship was what made them so successful. They couldn't be stopped, and it looked like they were headed for even bigger things. Still, the fights within the band got worse, and fans who were just listening to the music often didn't notice. In reality, though, things between Sammy and Eddie got worse while they were making their first album together, 5150. They were able to make magic in the studio, but their different personalities started to show. Eddie was a great guitarist, but he had a strict artistic vision. Sammy, on the other hand, was more upbeat and driven, and he had his own way of doing things. At first, these differences didn't seem too big of a deal, but as time went on, the gap between the two partners grew. Sammy really wanted to keep the band going strong, but Eddie's personal problems, especially with drugs, started to get in the way of his work and his relationships with other band members. After that, there were a lot of artistic differences, personal fights, and growing anger on both sides. This wasn't just a job for Sammy. it was his family. He joined Van Halen when the band was already a huge name in rock, and he quickly became an important part of their success. But Eddie's actions started to make their relationship worse, no matter how hard he tried to keep the band together. Eddie's personal problems caused a lot of instability, which made it almost impossible for Sammy to keep working there. They were supposed to work together, but things turned bad, and it was clear that something had to give. Sammy was finally fired in 1996. It was a terrible choice, but it seemed like it had to be made because of the situation. Now that things were getting worse, it didn't make sense for Sammy to stay. The golden age of Van Halen ended, leaving fans sad and asking what could have been. Once the show was over, Sammy had a great solo career, but Van Halen's influence was always there. Talks and whispers, along with a strong feeling of unfinished business, went on for years. Sammy's leaving was a turning point in the history of the band. Even though Van Halen kept going with different singers, something was still missing. No one could ever doubt Eddie's brilliance, but the band had changed. Sammy was always there, and many people still wanted to see them all again. But that was never really possible as long as Eddie and Sammy's problems hadn't been fixed. Eddie died in 2020, and afterward, many friends and former bandmates thought about how he changed rock music. His technical skill and unique sound helped shape the style and inspired artists for generations. But Eddie's personal problems and his troubled friendship with Sammy left behind a confusing legacy. In his thoughts, Sammy talked about how painful it was to be apart from Eddie for so long and how they had both changed. Even though they had fights for years, Sammy talked fondly about the time they spent together and praised Eddie's singing skills and their undeniable stage chemistry. That being said, he also said that they never really talked about their problems and that the band broke up because they couldn't work out their differences. We don't know what will happen next with Sammy and Eddie's stories, but one thing is for sure. Their gifts to rock music will never be forgotten. Some of the most famous music of the 1980s and 1990s was made by them together in Van Halen, and the band's impact can still be felt today. Fans still enjoy what they did with 5150, OU 812, For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge, and Balance because it is timeless. But the problems between the two men that haven't been fixed will always be a part of the story. Even though they were very successful, people will always wonder what might have been if they had been able to get along. The story of Van Halen's rise and final fall with Sammy Hagar is complicated. There were happy times and sad times. But in the end, it's about two incredibly skilled artists who changed rock music forever. Eddie Van Halen will always be remembered for his original guitar playing and contributions to the genre. Sammy Hagar will also be remembered for how he changed the sound of the band and how good his voice was. It's not clear what will happen to their heritage in the future, but it is clear that their music will continue to inspire rock fans and artists of the future. The story of Van Halen, Sammy Hagar, and Eddie Van Halen shows that even the biggest bands have personal problems sometimes, and that the stresses of touring and relationships can break up the best partnerships. Fans still feel nostalgic about the music that defined a certain age when they think about the past. The fights, breakups, and unsolved problems will always be a part of the story, but they shouldn't take away from the amazing music that was made. Sammy Hagar and Eddie Van Halen will always be remembered in rock history, and fans will always be able to sing the epic songs they wrote together.